Perfect. And I'm going to try to share now. If anybody can't see that, let me know. I'll go ahead and make it bigger.
Right.
There we go. Everyone can see that. Perfect. And it's Petrik, but everyone says Petrik, so it doesn't bother me at all.
Sorry.
Call me whatever you would like. Yes, so I'm doing the module 10 tricks and cheats of the OCD con artist. I volunteered for this one. I love this module, but then again, I think I say that about everyone. Back when I was starting to kind of throw myself into I-CBT and learn more about it, if anybody remembers, I would put a lot of scenarios and examples in the Facebook group, whether it was like personal examples from when I was younger or current ones. And I remember one example I put about a death obsession, and a few people hopped on saying, I can't wait for you to get to module 10 when I posted my little OCD story, which was intriguing because I was like, what is it about module 10 that's so interesting? And then once I got to it, I understood why. So I tend to use this module kind of in conjunction with module 5, which is about OCD is 100% in imagination. As I clarified at first, I was wondering, do I have to go exactly in order of all the modules? And then kind of got some clarification that you can kind of jump around based on what your client needs. And I found this one to just fit right in with the whole OCD is in the imagination, because as your clients and yourself come up with their OCD narrative, and you're helping them see if there's any direct evidence in the here and now in this narrative, this is where we will pull in what we call the tricks and cheats, help them identify any of these tricks or cheats to see if it's actual direct evidence in the here and now, or if OCD is just trying to trick you. So I like to kind of, as this module suggests, refer to OCD as a con artist, which is trying to just be sneaky and tricky and scam you and make you believe that this story, this obsessional story you have, is credible and based in reality. It makes it so elaborate and convincing, which is why we get sucked in, because we believe this is actually happening. But this is what the tricks and cheats are doing. It's making you believe that they are real, but what it actually does is just pulls you further and further away from reality. So these tricks and cheats, as we go through module 5, helping them see it's built in the imagination, we are able to recognize that these statements, these reasons they are bringing in to make it sound so believable, are actually, like I said, pulling you further away from reality. But it's what makes this story false, and therefore it makes it completely irrelevant to the here and now and what's actually occurring in front of you. So our goal is, if we can help our clients identify some of these tricks, some of these sneaky little things OCD is doing and saying to you to pull you in, we can help keep ourselves from getting absorbed into that bubble. We can help identify that crossover point where we get sucked in and recognize what OCD is like trying to trick us into believing. And then hence the later modules, helping them come back to the here and now, and like what's actually occurring in front of me. So I get this, not so much question, but criticism a lot when, we start talking about I-CBT to others. I think the first thing people hear when they hear a cognitive therapy is they're like, but we're not supposed to challenge the content. We're not supposed to challenge thoughts. And so this is our reminder, especially when we're going to be talking about some of the specific thoughts of our OCD story here. This is a reminder that we are not challenging them. When my client tells me that germs do exist, I'm not challenging them, saying, no, you're fine, it's okay, you're safe, you can touch that. No, we are challenging their relevance to the here and now. So again, we're not saying, oh, you're safe, or that won't happen, or you can tolerate that, you can handle it even if it does happen. We're saying, but does that thought have any relevance to this moment in front of us? Obviously, using the reality sensing, our 5 senses, what do we actually hear, see, smell, taste, feel in front of us? But does this story actually have any relevance to this moment? So with that, I'm going to just jump into some of these tricks and cheats so that we can have time to discuss it, specific examples later. The other reason I volunteered for this module is because I'd already created like social media posts on most of these, so it kind of just made it easy. Slideshow is done. First one, which I have seen in almost every single obsessional story so far I have come to, is mismatching, where we tend to look at information that maybe happened to someone else, like hearsay examples, in an attempt to give it credibility, to say, see, it's happened to somebody else, or I saw on the news that this occurred, so therefore it could happen. And so this mismatch when it occurs in an obsessional story is telling us because it happened to someone else, and that is proof that it could happen to us. So here's my example. Let's say your obsessional story is about, what if I left the garage door open and I get robbed? And maybe part of the reason that they use in their story is, well, this has happened to somebody I knew. My neighbor did this once. And so again, during module 5, we're going to be helping them come back to this moment and saying, but even if that happened to a neighbor, yes, that might be a fact. Even if it happened to a neighbor, does that give credibility, evidence in this moment that it's actually occurring to you? What do you see or hear that actually tells us it's happening to you? So mismatching, I see, is probably one of the most common. I see that all the time, in addition to out of context facts, which, as I tell clients, like, that is a fact. Maybe they say something like germs do exist. That is a fact. It's actually very validating for them to hear. That is fact, but it's an out of context fact, meaning it doesn't actually have to do with the reality here and now. Other example other than germs, I've heard individuals say, well, I am an impulsive person. This is a fact. Maybe I have ADHD, and sometimes I do just things impulsively, like say something I shouldn't, or shopping impulsively. So therefore, they use that as a fact in their story, saying, I could just stab somebody. That is a fact. And so if we're able to identify this little trick here, saying, yes, it is a fact, but this is considered an out of context fact, meaning just because, yes, that may be true, doesn't mean it's any more true in this exact moment in front of us. So I would say, again, just like mismatching, almost every obsessional story I've come across has out of context facts in it. And I have a few personal examples I'll share later and what that looks like. Living the fear. This is basically where our anxiety or OCD can actually simulate reality and make us believe that these symptoms are real. This happens a lot with health obsessions, where the anxiety from our health obsessions gets so big and so strong that the symptoms, then we start to feel pains, or we start to notice things even bigger. And then we're like, that's almost used as reasoning in our story, because we're like, see, that pain really is there. Or if you're worried that you may vomit, then you could start to feel nauseous. And then, of course, we use this as credibility to say, see, I really am sick, or I'm really going to vomit. But once again, there's been a lot of discussions in the Facebook group about sensations and physical symptoms and how relevant they are, if that's actual evidence in the here and now. And it could be a fact that you are feeling nauseous, but the story we're attaching to it may be obsessional. So that's another one. Going deep. This was probably the one, and more people can give examples later, the one that I don't know if I got most confused by, or it's so simple that I was trying to make more of it than it really is. But to me, I think of it like just keep going deeper and deeper, or down the rabbit hole, almost trying to find facts or prove this obsession to be real. And it just keeps taking us farther and farther away from reality. So I think of contamination OCD examples, where it might just start off with like, hey, my water is contaminated, or there are germs there. But then the client keeps trying to go further and further, saying, but I probably could send it to a laboratory and they probably would find it. And they keep trying to come up with more and more to try to explain it or justify it, the idea of just going farther and farther. And each step they take is, again, pulling us away from this moment and what's actually occurring in front of us. Distrust of the senses or self, I think, is the most obvious. Just like the name says, it's when we distrust our senses. So in one of my examples I'll show later, it was distrusting myself and, let's say, my sexuality, even though it's like I know, or I feel like I know. OCD is like, but what if you don't know yourself? But what if you did like that? What if you're, all those questions. But it also could be about your 5 senses and saying, oh, even though you saw the door is locked, it might say, OCD might pull in, but maybe your vision's going bad. What if it was blurry and you didn't see it correctly? So it could be any of your senses, even though, because when we bring in reality sensing and we say, okay, here's what I see, feel, hear, OCD could easily be like, but did I actually hear that? Or was I hallucinating? So that's distrust of the senses or yourself. Reverse reasoning is one of my favorites. Typically, when we come to conclusions, we start with an observation. So I see the door is locked, therefore, I make a conclusion. I'm safe, or the door is locked. Or my hands look clean, therefore, yeah, they're probably clean. However, with reverse reasoning, it doesn't start with an observation in the here and now. It starts with some idea or facts, out of context facts. So instead of, oh, the doorknob looks clean, I think it is clean. It's like, but it could be dirty, but I remember somebody touching it earlier. Oh, and sometimes people have dirty hands and they don't wash them and then they touch that doorknob. So it starts off with some idea, some story, to then come up with the conclusion. Then there's a double jeopardy. Very tricky here, where sometimes you actually give in to OCD, you obey it, you do the thing it tells you to do, and then that just creates even more doubt. So my example here on the screen is, let's say you're doubting if you turned off an appliance or something like a hair straightener, and you've given and you go check the hair straightener and you're like, okay, it's turned off. But then once you walk away, you start to doubt, oh my gosh, but what if I bumped the on button when I was checking it? Or another example with contamination OCD, let's say you gave in and you washed your hands, you walk away, and then you're like, oh, but then I had to touch the faucet to turn the water off. What if I recontaminated myself? So it's almost like the obeying OCD then just creates a whole new doubt, which we usually see. Usually just obeying OCD doesn't make it go away. So there's ideas there. And then testing it out. This is where sometimes OCD will actually convince you to test out its story and its doubt to try to prove it wrong or to prove it right. And then it uses this as more evidence. It's saying, hey, I'll test out and see if I'm straight or if I'm gay. And so I decide to look at other women and test my sexual attraction for them. Well, then OCD jumps in and is like, well, see, you're staring at other women. Like, why would you do that if you weren't attracted to them? So it tries to use that as ammo against you. So those were all my pretty social media posts, but here's two more I'm going to throw in. I hadn't created anything about, but maybe this time. You will hear this in a lot of different ways in OCD stories. It might be, but maybe this time it could happen, or, but it's a possibility, but maybe, but what if, but it could happen. So all those phrases we hear a lot from clients. All these maybes still have no relevance in this present moment, even if it could happen next time, even if that's a fact, like it could happen, it could possibly happen, it's still not direct evidence right now that it is occurring. So whenever I usually hear some of these phrases, but maybe next time, but maybe this time it's different, but it is possible, I tend to do a little kind of exercise with my clients to help them understand that even if something is a possibility, doesn't give us any more evidence in this moment. So I'll do this exercise saying like, okay, there are a million possibilities that could happen to you every day, right? You could possibly get in your car today and put the key in the ignition and it blows up, right? Now, little caveat, I'm not going to give any examples of things that actually do are part of their OCD because I don't want to trigger them in this moment, in this exercise. But so we go through this car example, like, so it's a possibility that your car could blow up, right? And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, how come you're not acting on this possibility? How come you're not like checking under the hood, not smelling anything, not like starting the car and then running away to see if it blows up? How come you're not doing that? And most clients, think I'm silly. And they're like, well, because it's not happening. And I ask them, but how do you know it's not happening? And they say, because I don't see anything different. I don't hear anything weird. I'm not smelling any kind of fumes. And I'm like, this is a great kind of segue into reality sensing, saying like, oh, so you're saying your senses are not telling you that anything's happening right now. Okay, so they get that. And then I'll just provide a bunch of other examples. When you go to work today, it's a possibility that a meteor just comes down and destroys your building, right? They're like, well, yeah, I guess it's a possibility. well, how come you're not acting on that possibility? How come you're not like taking cover, going into some kind of, I don't know where people would cover for meteor, but doing the things people would do. And they're like, well, because it's not happening. Well, again, how do you know it's not happening? And then they give their information based on their senses, saying, I don't see any cracks in the ceiling. I don't hear a meteor coming towards me. I haven't seen anything on the news saying it's coming today. So then we bring this back to whatever possibility they were saying in their obsessional story, saying, okay, so all of these possibilities, just like your possibility, they could happen. Maybe this time it's different, right? But we're not acting on any of those because our senses tell us otherwise. And that kind of brings them to that conclusion, like, yeah, even if their obsessional doubt is a possibility, do we actually need to act on that possibility if our five senses aren't telling us anything different? So that's a little tangent, but I do that with clients a lot. And then maybe later, maybe you're not contaminated right now, but maybe later it could happen, but maybe something bad could happen in the future. One example I've seen is about the idea of the butterfly effect, where it's like, okay, if I don't do this thing just right, it might have this trickle down effect to all these other bad things. And then eventually my mom dies. It might be a year from now, right? It could be 10 years from now. So this is one of those where, no, we're not going to have proof in this very moment that mom is going to die, but clients might use this, but maybe later something bad would happen in their story as proof. So once again, yeah, but maybe later, maybe it could happen in 10 years, but in this moment, in this present moment, is there any evidence? So here, I'll show you a couple examples where I practice this. Again, I thought the best way to practice was just to immerse myself and use examples. So this was one of my obsessional stories. Fun sexual orientation OCD going on. I tried to use all these reasonings of, it's happened to a lot of people I actually know, that they've been in heterosexual relationships and then 20 years down the road, they realize they're gay. And so, I used hearsay examples. I used facts, the fact that like you can't know your sexuality, like there literally is no test, no blood test to show that. Also some of that, just living in the fear, it just feels so real, it just feels so big, it makes you anxious, therefore OCD is telling me that must mean something. So anyway, so I came up with the obsessional story back in, what is that, module 3 maybe. And then once I got to module 5 to like see, is there any evidence in this that's actually telling me it's happening? I pulled in the tricks and cheats from this chapter. Here you go, same story, but I threw in some of the tricks and cheats. You'll notice there's some out of context facts here, some distrust of myself when I'm like, but maybe I truly wanted it. Maybe I truly liked it. There's obviously some mismatching with those hearsay examples, and there's probably even more tricks in there that I didn't even make note of, but I wanted to give you an idea, and I'll show you one more example. Don't worry, all these slides will be on the website. No pressure there, I'll be on the website and everything. This was a real current one. I assumed everybody had this fear until I think I got married and realized like my husband thinks I'm insane. I have such obsessional doubt about the air above a trash can. I just assume like everybody thinks it's awful and disgusting and contaminated, and don't hover over a trash can. Don't do anything over a trash can that you don't want contaminated. I thought that was the norm until one day, I think my husband's peeling carrots or cucumbers just over the trash can, and I flipped. I was like, that's disgusting. Don't do that. Like now we can't eat that cucumber. He thought I was insane. And it wasn't until later that I think one time he was like clearing off a plate, the scraps off a plate, throwing them into a trash can. And then he went to use that plate for dessert. And I was so disgusted because I'm like, that plate is now dirty. And he's trying to tell me like it didn't touch anything. And it wasn't until years later that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my OCD story that's saying like there are germs. Germs do exist. That trash can is nasty. I can see it. I can smell it. Germs are airborne. So once I decided to practice on this specific doubt, I took that narrative and identified a lot of the tricks and cheats, some maybe laters, I'll get contaminated, some out of context facts about the germs and that they can be airborne. The distrust of my senses, saying this plate is contaminated, even though I don't see anything to be different about it. I even used the example that, I knew one other person that had the same fear. So I used that mismatching example saying, see, I'm not crazy. Somebody else felt the same way. And what's interesting, I was just using I-CBT, using the modules for myself more to practice so I could understand the concepts and so I could later use with clients. But then I went through all the modules with my whole dirty trash can air. And I think it was a few weeks later that I'm like, just one day I'm peeling my cucumber over the trash can, didn't even think anything of it. And then I'm like, this doesn't even bother me, because now it's almost like I look at it like, how silly is that? Like, based on my senses, what's going on right here now, I can tell I haven't bumped the cucumber on the trash can. I don't see anything on the cucumber. And I just keep acting on that story, that alternate story that I've created. And so it was interesting in that moment. I wasn't trying to do exposures. I wasn't trying to tolerate any uncertainty. I was just living my life based on what I saw to be true. And I didn't even realize, like, wow, that was easy for me. So there's my little success story. Here's just a little graphic I created, just kind of talking about some of the steps. Obviously, there's way more to I-CBT than just this, but if we can help our clients identify these tricks and cheats that are like pulling us further and further away from reality, thus making our story false, thus making our story irrelevant, we can pause and see the story for what it is, just this creative, imaginative, elaborate story. And it helps keep us from getting sucked in. Combine that then with some of the next steps, using our reality sensing to create our alternate story about what I actually know to be true in front of me. Like, I'm peeling cucumbers above the trash can. Nothing touches, the cucumber doesn't touch the trash can. The peeler doesn't touch the trash can. It looks clean, therefore I can eat the cucumber. I now am living that alternate story from practicing that, and the rest is history. So that's my fast little presentation. That's me. And we can discuss. I'm not an expert in this, so don't give me all the questions. Give them to other people.
Jeremy, would you like to ask your question live?
Yeah, sure. Just because we've been talking about disgust, I'm curious from your personal example about the trash can, after you are able to laugh at the fear that the cucumber is really getting contaminated, do you still experience like a hyper sense of disgust with the trash can that you push through, or no?
Good question. So I had that disgust response, obviously before, but I think that was paired up also with actual fearful consequences. It wasn't just like, I have a lot of contamination OCD ones where it's more just like, I can't handle it. I can't tolerate it. This one, though, had such a specific fearful consequence attached to it that it's interesting, like that almost just kind of disappeared once I saw it for what it was. That disappeared. So the disgust is gone. And that's interesting. I've never thought about it in those terms. So yes, it's gone, but I think it's mostly because it was also more the consequence, the fact that this plate is dirty, don't eat off of it. That bothered me.
Thank you. I mean, that actually helps a lot, because I think we've heard a lot of times where disgust doesn't resolve and thinking disgust is something else entirely, but clearly there are instances where the story is what leads to disgust rather than the stimulus itself, and that it took some digging in for you to make that make sense for yourself. That's an interesting insight.
Good question. I hadn't even thought about that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question too. This morning, I was trying to read, and I can't remember the actual topic on the Facebook group, but Fred's comments talking about deductive versus inductive reasoning and trying to wrap my head around that. So I'm wondering, is reverse reasoning then an example of the difference between the deductive and inductive reasoning? Or could you give a specific example of reverse reasoning?
Is Fred here? Does he want to speak on that? Or I could probably give another example of reverse reasoning. Marco?
Somebody else make an example.
I didn't hear what you said, Fred.
My sound is really.
Oh,
My connection is pretty bad. I'm not sure if I'm coming through. Well, another example would be psychopaths don't feel guilty. I don't feel guilty, so therefore I might be a psychopath. Typical example of reverse reasoning. Did you get that? Or my connection is not that good.
yes. I guess that's the hardest one for me to understand, I think. So I'm still trying to, as many specific examples as I can get would be helpful, but I can also post maybe in the group and people can put some examples.
I think Kate posted in the chat kind of another explanation. Typically with reverse reasoning, we start with, or with reasoning, we start with evidence, something we see, something we feel. Again, like I see that my hands are clean. I washed them. There's no more mud on them. And then we make the conclusion saying, okay, therefore they're clean. With reverse reasoning, it will often start with either an idea, with the conclusion in itself saying, oh, I think they're still dirty. There's still germs on there. Therefore it's dirty. So instead of starting with reality and observations, it will start with an idea or maybe already kind of an inference or conclusion.
Okay. Yeah, that does help. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.